The calm before the storm. Jack Williams sat in his usual seat at the corner table of Rusty's Tavern, a small-town bar tucked into the heart of the Pacific Northwest. The place smelled of sawdust, aged whiskey, and nostalgia. For Jack, this wasn't just a watering hole. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could blend into the background and let his burdens slip away, even if only for a few hours. The wooden door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air. Jack barely glanced up from his glass of bourbon as a group of bikers walked in. Their heavy boots clomped against the floor, chains jangling, and laughter bouncing off the walls. It wasn't the first time Jack had seen them, but tonight felt different. At the head of the group was a man with a square jaw and a leather jacket adorned with patches that told stories of long rides and rough living. His name was Brock Tanner, and he led the Steel Wolves, a notorious gang known for pushing people around. Jack had seen their kind before, brash, cocky, and always looking for trouble. Rusty, the bar's owner and a man Jack considered a friend, gave him a subtle nod from behind the counter. It was a silent message. Be ready. Rusty had been a Marine in another life, and knew trouble when he saw it. Old man Jack. Brock bellowed, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. Still hogging that corner like it's your throne. Jack sighed, his grip tightening slightly around his glass. He wasn't one for conflict anymore. His soldier days were far behind him, left on distant battlefields, and in dark memories he didn't care to revisit. But he also wasn't one to be pushed around. Just enjoying my drink, Jack said evenly, not bothering to look up. Brock swaggered over, his crew following like a pack of wolves scenting blood. They spread out, their presence dominating the room. Locals glanced nervously at one another, some edging closer to the exit. You know Jack, Brock said, leaning on the edge of Jack's table. I've heard stories about you. Old war hero, right? Big shot soldier. Bet those days feel like a dream now, huh? Just another washed-up relic in a bar. The words stung more than Jack let on. He met Brock's gaze, his eyes calm but piercing. If you're looking for a story, I don't have one for you. Brock smirked, leaning closer. Oh, come on, Jack. Don't be shy. Tell us about how you used to be someone. Behind the bar, Rusty set down the glass he'd been polishing and stepped forward. That's enough, Brock. If you're here for a drink, then drink. If not, hit the road. Brock turned his gaze to Rusty, his smirk fading into a sneer. Stay out of this, old man. We're just having a friendly chat. The tension in the room thickened, a palpable weight pressing on everyone. Jack remained still, his posture relaxed, but his eyes didn't waver from Brock's. Respect goes a long way, Jack said quietly. You might want to think about that. Brock chuckled darkly, but there was an edge of unease in his voice. Respect. You think you're owed respect just because you used to wear a uniform. One of Brock's men, a wiry figure with a scar running down his cheek, snickered. Yeah, Jack. Let's hear about those glory days. Maybe we'll throw you a parade. Jack took a slow sip of his bourbon, his calm demeanor never breaking. The thing about respect, he said, setting the glass down, is that it's earned. You wouldn't understand that. The room seemed to hold its breath. Brock's grin faded completely, replaced by a flicker of anger. He straightened, towering over Jack's seated form. Careful, old man, Brock growled. You don't want to get on my bad side. Rusty moved around the bar, his hands at his sides, ready to step in. Brock, I said that's enough. But Brock wasn't listening. He reached out and shoved Jack's glass off the table, the bourbon spilling across the worn wood before the glass shattered on the floor. The sound echoed in the silence. Jack slowly stood, his 6-foot frame towering over most of the bikers despite his age. His movements were deliberate, almost casual, but there was an air of tension in every step. His gaze locked on Brock, steady and unyielding. You want to see what an old man can do, Jack said, his voice low but carrying a weight that made the hairs on the back of Brock's neck stand up. For a brief moment, Brock hesitated. There was something in Jack's eyes, something hard, unrelenting, and dangerous. It wasn't the look of a man who wanted to fight. It was the look of a man who had fought more battles than Brock could imagine, and had walked away every time. But Brock wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. "I'll give you a pass this time, old man," Brock said, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "But next time, you won't be so lucky." He turned and motioned for his crew to follow. They filed out, their laughter ringing hollow as they mounted their motorcycles and roared away into the night. The bar let out a collective breath of relief. Rusty stepped closer to Jack, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" he asked. Jack nodded, his gaze still fixed on the door. "Yeah, just another day." But as the patrons returned to their conversations, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He knew men like Brock. They didn't walk away quietly. And Jack wasn't the kind of man to leave things unfinished. As he sat back down, Rusty handed him a fresh glass of bourbon. "They don't know who they're messing with," Rusty said. Jack smiled faintly, but his eyes were distant, locked on memories he'd rather forget. "No," he said quietly. "They don't." The bar settled back into its usual rhythm, but Jack knew it was only the calm before the storm. And storms, as Jack had learned long ago, were inevitable. Old scars and new shadows. The next morning, the sun broke over the jagged peaks surrounding the small town, casting long shadows over Rusty's tavern. Jack Williams sat on the porch of his modest home, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his hands. The smell of pine mingled with the rich aroma, but Jack's mind was far from peaceful. The events of the previous night replayed in his head like an old war movie. Brock Tanner's smug face, the disrespectful taunts, and the crash of his bourbon glass hitting the floor. Each detail stuck with him. Jack had spent a lifetime learning to keep his emotions in check, but something about the encounter gnawed at him. It wasn't the words or even the humiliation. It was the nagging sense that Brock wasn't finished. Jack's neighbor, Ed, a retired Navy man with a limp and a sharp sense of humor, hobbled over, waving a hand. "Morning, Jack," Ed said, lowering himself into the creaky chair beside him. "Heard about the ruckus at Rusty's last night." Jack glanced at Ed, unsurprised. News traveled fast in their small town. Nothing worth talking about. Ed chuckled, his gray mustache twitching. "When the steel wolves are involved, it's always worth talking about. Brock Tanner's been stirring up trouble since the day he rode into town. You know that." Jack didn't reply. Instead, he sipped his coffee and stared into the woods beyond his yard. The silence stretched between them until Ed leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You think they'll come back?" Jack finally turned to face him. "Men like Brock don't let things go. They push until someone pushes back." Ed nodded grimly. "If that's the case, you better be ready. You may have hung up your uniform, but I know you haven't forgotten what it means to fight." Jack gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not looking for a fight, Ed." "Sometimes, Jack," Ed said, "the fight finds you." By the time evening rolled around, the town had returned to its sleepy routine. Families gathered for dinner, shopkeepers closed their stores, and the dim glow of lights from Rusty's tavern spilled onto the empty streets. Jack found himself walking toward the bar again, as if drawn by an invisible force. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain that had yet to fall. Jack's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the wooden door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle, before pushing it open. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and familiar. Locals sat at the bar and scattered tables, chatting in low voices. Rusty gave Jack a nod as he stepped in, a fresh bourbon already waiting for him at his usual spot. "You sure you want to be here tonight?" Rusty asked as Jack sat down. "After last night, I wouldn't blame you for laying low." Jack picked up his glass, swirling the amber liquid. "I don't run from bullies, Rusty." Rusty smiled faintly. That's what I figured. The two men fell into a comfortable silence, but the quiet didn't last long. The door slammed open, and the unmistakable sound of heavy boots filled the room. Jack didn't need to look to know who it was. Brock Tanner and his crew swaggered in, their leather jackets gleaming under the bar's dim lights. Brock scanned the room, his eyes landing on Jack almost immediately. A slow grin spread across his face. "Well, well," Brock said, his voice loud enough to silence the room. "If it isn't the town hero." Jack didn't flinch, didn't even turn to look at Brock. He sipped his bourbon, his calm demeanor as unshakable as ever. "Don't you ever get tired of this place, old man?" Brock continued, sauntering over to Jack's table. "Seems like you'd want to stay out of my way after last night." Rusty moved to intervene, but Jack held up a hand, stopping him. "It's fine, Rusty." Brock leaned over the table, his grin widening. "You got something to say, old man? Or are you just going to sit there like a statue?" Jack set his glass down and finally looked up, his gaze locking with Brock's. "What do you want, Brock?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it made Brock falter for a split second. He quickly recovered, straightening and crossing his arms. "What I want," Brock said, his voice hardening, "is for you to know your place. You think you're better than me because you used to be somebody. Well, newsflash, Jack, you're not. You're just an old man clinging to a past no one cares about." The room was deathly silent, every patron frozen in place. Jack rose slowly, his movements deliberate. Despite the years etched into his face, there was a strength in his posture that hadn't faded. "Brock," Jack said, his voice low and steady, "you don't know a damn thing about me, but if you're looking to start something, you'd better be ready to finish it." The tension crackled like a live wire. Brock's grin faltered again, but he masked it with bravado. "Is that a threat?" Jack's eyes didn't waver. "It's a fact." Before Brock could respond, the door opened again, and the sound of boots echoed through the room. Everyone turned to see a group of men entering the bar. They weren't locals, but their presence was unmistakable, calm, calculated, and commanding. At the head of the group was a man in his early 40s, his hair cropped close and his stance exuding authority. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure. Captain Ryan Caldwell, Jack's old commanding officer. The men who followed Ryan were equally formidable. Each of them carried an air of quiet confidence, their movements synchronized as if they were still on the battlefield. They spread out, taking in the room with sharp eyes before their gazes landed on Jack. "Jack," Ryan said, his voice calm but firm, "looks like we showed up just in time." Brock and his crew exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado fading as they realized they were no longer the most intimidating presence in the room. The Steel Wolves had faced their fair share of fights, but this was different. These weren't ordinary men. They were soldiers. Jack smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time that evening. "Ryan," he said, "I didn't know you were in town." Ryan smirked. "We heard you might need some backup." Brock stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Who the hell are you?" Ryan turned to him, his expression unreadable. "We're the reason you're going to walk out of here and never come back." The room was silent as Brock stared at Ryan, weighing his options. He could see the steel in the man's eyes, the same resolve he'd seen in Jack the night before. This wasn't a fight he could win. After a long moment, Brock sneered and motioned for his crew to follow him. "Let's go," he said, his voice dripping with false bravado. "This place isn't worth our time." As the Steel Wolves filed out, the bar let out a collective sigh of relief. Ryan turned to Jack, his smirk widening. "Still getting into trouble, huh?" Ryan said. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Trouble finds me." Ryan clapped him on the shoulder. "Good thing you've still got a unit to back you up." Jack raised his glass in silent thanks, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. Shadows of the past. The night was quiet again, but the air inside Rusty's tavern still buzzed with tension, like the faint hum of a storm brewing just beyond the hills. Jack Williams sat back in his chair, his hands resting on the table, his mind lost in thought as the room settled after the dramatic exit of Brock Tanner and his gang. The sudden appearance of Captain Ryan Caldwell, and the old unit had shifted the dynamic. But Jack knew this wasn't the end. Ryan, ever the leader, leaned against the bar with an ease that belied the intensity of the moment. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, taking stock of the patrons and the lingering unease. His men, hardened soldiers who had served alongside Jack in their younger years, remained stationed at different points in the bar, their presence a silent but formidable warning. "Still picking fights with the locals, Jack?" Ryan asked, breaking the silence. His tone was light, but there was an edge of concern beneath it. Jack smirked faintly, lifting his bourbon to his lips. "Didn't pick this one, Ryan. Trouble just has a way of finding me." Ryan chuckled, though his gaze remained serious. "That much hasn't changed." Rusty approached with a fresh bottle of bourbon, setting it on the bar as if offering a peace treaty. "Figured you'd all want another round," he said, glancing at Ryan and then at Jack. "You've earned it." Jack nodded his thanks, pouring another glass. "So what brings you out here, Ryan? Last I heard, you were stationed overseas." Ryan's expression darkened slightly, a shadow crossing his features. "We're not stationed anywhere these days. The world's quieter for us now, but that doesn't mean the work ever stops." Jack knew better than to pry. They had all made sacrifices, left pieces of themselves in deserts, jungles, and mountains far from home. Some scars were visible. Others ran deeper, etched into the soul. He simply nodded and took another sip of his drink. One of Ryan's men, a wiry figure named Carter, approached their table, his sharp eyes darting toward the door. "You know they'll be back," he said, his voice low but steady. Jack glanced at him, his jaw tightening. "I know. They're not the type to let this slide," Carter continued. "Guys like Brock thrive on power, and you just knocked him down a peg. He's going to want to prove himself." Rusty leaned on the bar, his expression grim. "The Steel Wolves have been stirring up trouble all over this area. Intimidation, fights, extortion, you name it. If Brock feels like he lost face tonight, he's not just coming back for you, Jack. He's coming back for all of us." Ryan crossed his arms, his stance unwavering. "Then we'll be ready." Jack raised an eyebrow. "We?" Ryan smirked. "You think we're going to let you handle this alone? You've got a team, Jack. Always have." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. It had been years since he'd felt the camaraderie of a unit, the unspoken bond that made them more than soldiers. He'd spent so long carrying his burdens alone that the thought of having backup felt foreign. "Appreciate it," Jack said quietly, his voice gruff. The following day, Jack found himself standing in the clearing behind Rusty's tavern, a familiar sense of preparation settling over him. Ryan and the rest of the unit had commandeered the space, setting up a makeshift training area with sandbags, targets, and other tools of the trade. The locals who stopped by to watch were met with stern looks, sending them on their way before they could linger too long. "You didn't have to set all this up," Jack said, watching as Carter and another man, Lucas, tested the tension on a punching bag. "I'm not looking for a war." Ryan, standing nearby with his arms crossed, gave him a knowing look. "It's not about looking for a fight, Jack. It's about being ready when one finds you." Jack sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm not the man I used to be." Ryan stepped closer, his voice firm. "None of us are. But that doesn't mean you've lost what made you who you were. You're still Jack Williams, the man who led us through hell and back. That doesn't just go away." Jack didn't respond, but he felt a flicker of something, pride, maybe, or resolve, stir within him. He watched as the men worked, their movements precise and efficient, their camaraderie as strong as ever. Despite the years that had passed, they fell back into their roles seamlessly. Lucas approached, tossing Jack a pair of gloves. We're not just here to flex muscles, Jack. Time to shake off the rust. Jack hesitated for a moment before slipping on the gloves. He squared up to the punching bag, his muscles protesting slightly at the movement. The first few punches were slow, hesitant, but as he found his rhythm, the old instincts kicked in. The bag swayed under the force of his hits, each strike sharper and more controlled than the last. "Still got it," Lucas said with a grin. Jack huffed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Barely." The men spent the rest of the day training, sharpening their reflexes, and testing their limits. Jack found himself drawn back into the rhythm of it, the familiar cadence of drills, and the shared purpose that bound them together. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, they were exhausted but focused. As they packed up the makeshift training ground, Ryan approached Jack, his expression serious. "We don't know when Brock will make his move, but it'll be soon. We've got your back, Jack, whatever happens." Jack nodded, his gratitude unspoken but understood. "Thanks, Ryan." Ryan clapped him on the shoulder. "We're not done yet. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we plan." Jack watched as the men dispersed, their silhouettes fading into the growing darkness. He stood alone for a moment, the weight of the coming storm heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. As the night settled over the town, Jack walked back to his small home, his mind turning over the possibilities. Brock Tanner wasn't going to back down. The Steel Wolves would come, and they'd come hard. But Jack wasn't the man Brock thought he was. He wasn't just an old soldier with stories to tell. He was a leader, and leaders didn't let their people face the fight alone. The wolves at the door. The sun dipped behind the jagged peaks surrounding the town, leaving the streets bathed in the orange glow of twilight. A quiet unease settled over the community as Jack Williams prepared for the inevitable. He stood outside his modest home, the crisp evening air biting against his skin, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Brock Tanner and the Steel Wolves were coming. It was only a matter of when. Jack wasn't alone in his preparation. Captain Ryan Caldwell and the old unit had spent the day turning Rusty's Tavern and its surrounding area into a fortress of sorts. Sandbags lined the windows, and heavy wooden beams reinforced the doors. The locals had been subtly warned to stay away for the night, their absence leaving the town eerily quiet. Jack made his way to the tavern, his boots crunching against the gravel road. When he reached the door, Ryan was waiting, his expression unreadable. "They'll come at night," Ryan said without preamble. "Brock's the type to make his move when he thinks he has the upper hand." Jack nodded. "And he'll bring everyone he can. He wants to make a statement." Ryan motioned for Jack to follow him inside. The tavern had been transformed. Tables and chairs were pushed against the walls, creating open space for movement. The bar itself was stocked with more than just bottles of bourbon. Beneath the counter, makeshift defenses were stored. Tools, supplies, and even a few surprises Rusty had dug out from his basement. Carter and Lucas were stationed near the windows, their eyes scanning the streets. The rest of the unit moved with purpose, checking supplies and reinforcing their positions. Despite the years that had passed since their time in uniform, their discipline and camaraderie remained intact. Rusty approached with a small smile, handing Jack a steaming mug of coffee. "Figured you'd need this." Jack accepted it with a nod. "Thanks, Rusty." Rusty leaned against the bar, his expression turning serious. "You think it'll get ugly?" Jack sighed, his gaze distant. "It always does." As the hours ticked by, the tension in the tavern grew thicker. The men spoke in low voices, their movements calculated and deliberate. Jack sat at a corner table, his mind racing through scenarios. His training told him to prepare for the worst, but he couldn't shake the gnawing doubt that they might be outnumbered. Brock Tanner wasn't just a bully. He was a man with a gang at his back, and something to prove. Ryan sat across from him, his sharp eyes studying Jack. "You've got that look." "What look?" Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. "The one that says you're carrying the weight of the world again." Jack smirked faintly. Old habits die hard. Ryan leaned forward, his voice dropping. You don't have to do this alone, Jack. You've got us. We're here for a reason. Jack met his gaze, the gratitude unspoken but clear. I know, and I appreciate it. The conversation was interrupted by a loud roar of motorcycle engines in the distance. The room fell silent, every man in the tavern freezing in place. Jack's jaw tightened as the sound grew louder, the unmistakable rumble of the steel wolves making their approach. They're here, Carter said from his position by the window. Ryan rose from his seat, his expression steely. Positions. The men moved with practiced efficiency, taking up their assigned spots. Jack stood near the bar, his eyes locked on the door. Rusty handed him a sturdy wooden bat, a relic from his younger days. Figured you'd want something in hand, Rusty said. Jack gripped the bat, its weight familiar and reassuring. Thanks. The roar of engines came to a halt, replaced by the crunch of boots on gravel. Through the windows, Jack could see them, Brock Tanner and his gang, a dozen strong, their silhouettes illuminated by the dim glow of streetlights. Brock stood at the forefront, his leather jacket gleaming, a smug grin plastered across his face. Jack Williams, Brock's voice rang out, echoing through the still night. Come on out, old man. Let's settle this. Ryan stepped up beside Jack, his presence a steadying force. What's the plan? Jack's gaze didn't waver from the door. We stand our ground. Rusty locked the door, the heavy thunk of the bolt echoing in the silence. The tavern was fortified, but Jack knew it wouldn't hold forever. Brock and his crew would test their defenses, and when they broke through, it would come down to a fight. Last chance, Jack. Brock called out, his tone mocking. You can come out and face me, or we'll come in and find you. Jack took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the bat. Let's see what they've got. The first crash came moments later, a heavy blow against the door that rattled the wood. Brock's gang shouted and jeered, their voices blending into a chaotic roar. Inside, the men stood ready, their eyes focused and their bodies tense. They'll try to break through, Ryan said. We hold the line here. The door shook again, splinters flying as the bikers rammed it with a steel pipe. Jack's pulse quickened, but his mind remained sharp. Years of training had prepared him for moments like this. When the door finally gave way, it wasn't Brock who charged in first. One of his men, a hulking figure with a chain wrapped around his fist, barreled through, his eyes wild. Jack moved before he could think, swinging the bat in a wide arc. The impact was solid, the man crumpling to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Brock's gang poured through the broken door, their shouts clashing with the barked commands of Ryan and his unit. The fight was brutal and fast, each blow landing with the force of years of pent-up frustration. Jack moved with a precision that surprised even him. Despite his age, his reflexes were sharp, his strikes calculated. He fought alongside his old comrades, their movements synchronized, as if no time had passed since their last mission. Brock entered the fray with a roar, his sights set on Jack. You think you're tough, old man. He snarled, swinging a crowbar. Jack dodged the first swing, countering with a blow to Brock's ribs. The younger man staggered but didn't go down, his rage driving him forward. The two clashed in the center of the room, their fight a blur of fists and fury. Around them, the unit held their ground, pushing back against the steel wolves with unrelenting force. Rusty joined the fray, wielding a pool cue with surprising skill, while Carter and Lucas worked as a seamless team to take down two bikers at once. The tide of the fight shifted as Brock's men began to falter, their bravado crumbling under the disciplined strength of the old soldiers. One by one, they fell, leaving Brock isolated and desperate. Jack landed a final blow to Brock's jaw, sending him sprawling to the floor. He stood over the defeated man, his chest heaving, the bat still gripped tightly in his hand. This is your last warning, Brock, Jack said, his voice low and firm. You and your gang are done here. Leave now, and don't come back. Brock glared up at him, blood dripping from his split lip. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse, but the weight of his defeat, and the sight of his men beaten and broken, forced him to concede. "You haven't seen the last of me," Brock spat, dragging himself to his feet. Jack stepped closer, his gaze hard. "Yes, I have." Brock hesitated before stumbling out the door, his gang limping behind him. The sound of their retreating motorcycles faded into the night, leaving the tavern in silence. Ryan clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder, a proud smile on his face. "Looks like the old man's still got it." Jack exhaled, the adrenaline fading. "Guess so." Rusty handed him a fresh drink, raising his own glass in a toast. "To Jack Williams, the man who never backs down." The men cheered, their spirits lifted despite the bruises and chaos. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of peace. The fight was over, for now. But he knew he wasn't alone in facing whatever came next. The price of peace. The morning after the fight at Rusty's Tavern broke with an eerie stillness. The town seemed to hold its breath, the echo of the previous night's violence lingering in the air. Jack Williams sat on the porch of the tavern, a mug of coffee in hand, his knuckles still raw and aching. The taste of victory was bittersweet. While they had driven Brock Tanner and the Steel Wolves out of town, Jack knew that peace always came at a price. Inside, Ryan and the unit were cleaning up the aftermath of the brawl. Broken chairs, shattered glass, and splintered wood were scattered across the floor, remnants of the chaos. Rusty barked orders, his tone as sharp as it had been in his military days. "Lucas, grab that broom. Carter, check the back door. Make sure nothing's left unsecured," Rusty called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. Jack watched them work, his mind elsewhere. The victory hadn't come easy, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Brock's parting words weren't just empty threats. Brock Tanner wasn't the type to take his defeat lying down, and the Steel Wolves had connections that reached far beyond the borders of their small town. Ryan stepped outside, his presence commanding as always. He leaned against the railing beside Jack, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You thinking about last night?" Jack nodded. "Brock's not done. You saw the look in his eyes when he left." Ryan folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "Yeah. Men like him don't walk away unless they're planning something bigger. But let him come. We'll be ready." Jack sighed, setting his mug down. "It's not just about being ready, Ryan. This town isn't a battlefield. These people didn't sign up for this fight." Ryan turned to face him, his gaze steady. "No, they didn't. But you and I both know the fight doesn't care about that. You can't protect everyone, Jack, but you can make sure they're not alone when the storm hits." By midday, the town began to stir. Word of the fight had spread like wildfire, and locals cautiously emerged from their homes, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Jack stood in the center of the town square, feeling the weight of their stares. He wasn't one for speeches, but he knew he couldn't avoid their questions forever. A small group of townspeople approached, led by Susan, a local teacher and longtime friend of Jack's. Her eyes were filled with worry as she stepped forward. "Jack," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is it over? Are we safe now?" Jack hesitated, glancing at Ryan, who had joined him. The captain gave a subtle nod, urging him to speak. "For now," Jack said, his voice steady but quiet. "But Brock Tanner isn't the kind to let things go. He might come back, and if he does, we'll be ready." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, their unease palpable. Susan frowned, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "And what if he brings more people? What if it's worse next time?" Jack looked around, meeting the eyes of each person in the crowd. These were his neighbors, people he'd shared beers with, worked alongside, and protected in his own quiet way for years. He felt the weight of their fear and the unspoken trust they placed in him. "We'll protect this town," Jack said firmly, "but I can't do it alone. I'll need your help. All of you." The crowd grew silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Susan nodded slowly, her expression softening. "What do you need us to do?" Over the next few days, the town came together in a way Jack hadn't seen in years. Inspired by the unity and determination of Jack's old unit, the locals began fortifying their defenses. Fences were reinforced, security cameras were installed, and people took turns patrolling the streets at night. Rusty turned the tavern into a makeshift command center, where Ryan and his men coordinated efforts. They trained volunteers in basic self-defense, teaching them how to handle themselves in case Brock and his gang returned. Jack worked alongside them, his hands calloused and his muscles sore from the long hours. Despite the physical toll, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a retired soldier anymore. He was a leader, someone his community looked to for guidance and strength. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, Jack found himself standing at the edge of town, gazing out at the winding road that led into the wilderness. Ryan joined him, his expression thoughtful. "You think they'll come back?" Ryan asked. Jack didn't answer immediately. He stared at the horizon, his mind racing with possibilities. If they do, it won't just be Brock and his crew. He'll call in reinforcements, people worse than him. Ryan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we make sure they regret it." Jack glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic." Ryan smirked. "Comes with the territory." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared past hanging between them. Despite the years that had passed and the miles they'd traveled, the bond they shared was as strong as ever. "You've got good people here, Jack," Ryan said finally. "They'll fight for this town. For you." Jack nodded, his gaze distant. "Let's just hope it doesn't come to that." But hope, Jack knew, wasn't enough. Late that night, the sound of approaching motorcycles shattered the stillness. Jack was jolted awake, his heart racing as he grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door. He stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold night air, and saw the headlights cutting through the darkness. The steel wolves were back, but they weren't alone. Dozens of riders filled the road, their engines growling like predators closing in on their prey. At the head of the pack was Brock Tanner, his sneer visible even in the dim light. Beside him rode a man Jack didn't recognize, a towering figure with a face hardened by years of violence. His jacket bore the insignia of a rival gang, one with a reputation far worse than the Steel Wolves. Jack's chest tightened as he realized what Brock had done. He hadn't just brought reinforcements, he'd brought a war. Ryan appeared at Jack's side, his expression grim. "Looks like they found some friends." Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the bat. "Then we'll show them what happens when they mess with the wrong town." The two men stood shoulder to shoulder, the glow of the oncoming bikes casting long shadows behind them. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Jack wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. And he was ready. The last stand. The rumble of engines filled the air, growing louder and more menacing as the convoy of bikers rolled into the outskirts of town. The Steel Wolves had returned, but this time, their numbers were bolstered by a crew of hardened outlaws, led by a man who radiated danger. His name was Victor Kane, a notorious enforcer with a reputation for leaving destruction in his wake. Jack Williams stood at the edge of town, the chill of the night air biting into his skin. Beside him, Captain Ryan Caldwell and the rest of their old unit prepared for what was coming. The town behind them was dark, its lights extinguished as the residents huddled in their homes. Though the streets were silent, Jack knew they weren't alone. The townspeople, armed with determination and makeshift weapons, were waiting for their cue. Ryan broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "It's time, Jack. We need to make our move before they get too close." Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving the approaching motorcycles. "We'll hold the line here. They'll expect chaos. Let's show them what discipline looks like." The first wave of bikers roared into the main street, their headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the town. Brock Tanner was at the forefront, his cocky grin illuminated by the glow of the convoy. He stopped his bike in the center of the road, his crew fanning out behind him. Victor Kane dismounted beside him, his towering frame imposing even in the dim light. "Williams," Brock shouted, his voice carrying over the growl of engines. "You've had your fun. Time to face the consequences." Jack stepped forward, his figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the tavern's porch light. "You should have stayed gone, Brock. This town isn't yours to take." Brock sneered. "You think a handful of washed-up soldiers and scared townsfolk are going to stop us? You're delusional." Victor Kane raised a hand, silencing Brock. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying an edge of authority. "You must be Jack Williams," he said, his tone measured. "I've heard about you, a legend in your time. But legends are just stories, and stories end." Jack's gaze didn't waver. "Then come and try to end mine." The fight began with an explosion of movement. Brock's gang charged forward, their shouts mingling with the roar of their engines. But they didn't expect what came next. From the shadows, Ryan and the rest of the unit emerge, their movements precise and coordinated. The soldiers attacked with the calculated efficiency of men who had spent years on the battlefield. Carter and Lucas led the charge, using the element of surprise to disarm and disable the first wave of bikers. The loud crack of Baton's meeting metal echoed through the streets, followed by the grunts of men hitting the ground. Rusty appeared from behind the bar, wielding a makeshift shield and swinging with the ferocity of a man defending his home. Jack took a deep breath, gripping the baseball bat in his hands. He stepped into the fray, his movements fluid despite the years. Brock charged at him, a steel pipe in hand, his face twisted with rage. "You should have stayed out of this, old man," Brock snarled, swinging the pipe with all his strength. Jack ducked the first swing, countering with a blow to Brock's ribs. The younger man staggered, but his anger only fueled him. He came at Jack again, his strikes wild but relentless. Jack held his ground, using his experience to outmaneuver Brock's raw aggression. Meanwhile, Victor Kane watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. When one of his men was taken down by Carter, Victor finally moved, striding into the chaos with the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight. He intercepted Carter with a single powerful strike, sending him sprawling to the ground. Ryan saw the exchange and charged at Victor, his fists clenched. The two men clashed in a brutal display of strength and skill, their blows landing with bone-shaking force. Ryan held his own, but Victor's sheer size and power gave him the upper hand. "Stay down," Victor growled, driving a knee into Ryan's gut. Ryan fell to one knee, gasping for breath. But he didn't give up. He grabbed a nearby plank of wood and swung it at Victor, catching him off guard and driving him back. As the battle raged on, the townsfolk made their presence known. From alleys and rooftops, they launched their counterattack, hurling rocks, bottles, and other improvised weapons at the bikers. The element of surprise turned the tide in their favor, forcing Brock's crew to retreat and regroup. Jack finally disarmed Brock with a well-placed strike, sending the steel pipe clattering to the ground. He grabbed Brock by the collar, his face inches from the younger man's. "This is over," Jack said, his voice cold. "You're done." Brock spat blood, his eyes burning with defiance. "You don't scare me." Jack's grip tightened. "You should be scared of what happens if you ever come back." He shoved Brock away, letting him stumble and fall to the ground. Brock scrambled to his feet, his bravado crumbling as he realized his gang was losing the fight. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Victor Kane, seeing his ally flee, cursed under his breath. He delivered one last punishing blow to Ryan before retreating, his men following suit. The sound of their motorcycles faded into the night, leaving behind a battered but victorious town. When the dust settled, the streets were littered with broken weapons and bruised bodies. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. Jack stood among them, his chest heaving, his hands bloody but steady. Ryan limped over, a faint smile on his face despite his injuries. "Looks like we did it." Jack nodded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "For now." Rusty approached with a bottle of bourbon, offering it to Jack. "To Jack Williams," he said, raising his own glass. "The man who reminded us what it means to stand together." The crowd cheered, their voices rising into the night. Jack took a long drink, feeling the burn of the bourbon in his throat. He looked around at the people who had fought beside him. Soldiers, townsfolk, friends, and felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. The fight had been won, but Jack knew the battle wasn't over. Peace was fragile, and the scars of the night would linger. But for the first time in a long time, he believed in the strength of his community and the bonds that held them together. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, Jack stood tall, ready for whatever came next. The dawn of resolution. The first light of dawn broke through the jagged peaks, painting the battered streets of the town in soft gold. Smoke from broken engines lingered in the air, and the faint smell of burnt rubber and sweat clung to the atmosphere. Jack Williams stood in the middle of the main street, his gaze steady despite the chaos that surrounded him. The steel wolves were gone, their tails tucked between their legs, but Jack knew this was more than a fleeting victory. It was a turning point. Captain Ryan Caldwell limped up beside him, his arm slung over Lucas for support. "Well, that wasn't exactly how I imagined my weekend would go," Ryan muttered, a tired grin tugging at his lips. Jack smirked faintly, the weariness etched into his features betraying the relief he felt. "You've had worse weekends." Ryan chuckled, wincing as Lucas helped him lower himself onto a nearby bench. "True, but I got to admit, this one will stick in my memory for a while." The townsfolk began emerging from their homes, their cautious steps giving way to expressions of awe and gratitude as they took in the scene. The remnants of the battle lay scattered around them, dented bikes, broken weapons, and the unmistakable signs of a hard-fought stand. Susan, the local teacher, rushed over, her face pale but determined. "Jack," she said, her voice trembling. "Is it over? Are we safe now?" Jack turned to her, his expression softening. "For now. Brock won't be back anytime soon." Susan's shoulders sagged with relief, and she placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you. All of you. I don't know what we would have done without you." Behind them, Rusty emerged from the tavern, carrying a tray laden with steaming cups of coffee. "Looks like we've got a story to tell now," he said, handing a cup to Jack. "Though I'm not sure anyone would believe it." Jack took the cup with a nod of thanks. "Some stories aren't meant to be told," he said, his voice quiet. "They're meant to be lived." As the morning wore on, the town began to pick up the pieces. Broken windows were boarded up, debris was cleared from the streets, and the makeshift defenses were dismantled. The soldiers worked alongside the townsfolk, their camaraderie bridging the gap between their worlds. Ryan approached Jack, his expression thoughtful. "You've built something special here, Jack. These people, they believe in you." Jack nodded, his gaze sweeping over the bustling activity. "They're stronger than they think. They just needed a reason to believe in themselves." Ryan clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, you gave them that. And more." Jack sighed, a faint smile crossing his face. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us." By midday, the town was nearly back to normal. The scars of the fight were still visible, but so was the resilience of its people. Jack stood on the steps of the tavern, watching as the townsfolk laughed and worked together. The unity that had emerged in the wake of the conflict filled him with a quiet sense of pride. Rusty joined him, a fresh bottle of bourbon in hand. "Looks like they're going to be all right," he said, pouring 2 glasses and handing one to Jack. "They'll be more than all right," Jack replied, raising his glass. "They'll thrive." Rusty grinned, clinking his glass against Jack's. "To the town. And to you, Jack, the man who reminded us what it means to fight for something worth protecting." Jack took a sip, savoring the warmth that spread through him. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, not just with the town, but with himself. As the day turned to evening, Ryan and the unit gathered in the tavern one last time. The townsfolk had insisted on throwing a small celebration, a chance to express their gratitude to the soldiers who had stood by their side. Laughter and music filled the air. The weight of the past days lifted, if only temporarily. Ryan raised a glass, his voice cutting through the noise. To Jack Williams, a leader, a fighter, and one hell of a stubborn old man. The room erupted in cheers and laughter, and Jack shook his head, a rare smile lighting up his face. He lifted his own glass. To all of you, to this town, and to the strength we found in each other. As the celebration continued, Jack slipped outside, needing a moment of quiet. The cool night air wrapped around him as he looked out over the darkened streets. The town had changed, not just because of the fight, but because of the spirit it had uncovered. And Jack had changed too. He had spent so long running from his past, but now he realized that his past was what made him who he was. Ryan joined him, a knowing look on his face. Thinking about staying? He asked. Jack nodded slowly. This town needs more than a fighter. It needs someone who can help them grow. Ryan smirked. Sounds like you found your next mission. Jack chuckled softly. Yeah, I guess I have. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the bonds of their shared experiences unspoken but undeniable. Finally, Ryan clapped Jack on the shoulder. Whatever comes next, you've got this. Jack watched as Ryan rejoined the celebration inside, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Jack Williams was ready to face it head-on. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Jack turned and walked back into the tavern, the sound of laughter and music welcoming him home.